I don't even call Israel Jewish in this traditional sense that diaspora Jews recognize it. I call it pagan idolatry.
In Israel, if you're Jewish, you are cast as the oppressor. You have no space to be very much else. And so if you're a person of conscience, you're forced into action, activism, attempts which so far have failed to achieve justice and equality.
Hello, my name is Stanley Heller. Welcome to The Struggle. It could pass, thanks to a long effort by Stop Solitary Connecticut and its allies. The Connecticut Judiciary Committee will most likely take up a bill on Friday, April 9th, that could end the torture and uselessness of solitary confinement. If it gets out of judiciary, it goes to the full legislature for consideration. On a cold April 2nd, people congregated in Hartford to try to push that bill forward.
Thank you everyone for coming out today. Next week, the Judiciary Committee will be voting on the PROTECT Act. That's why we're here, in addition to celebrating Good Friday and Passover and following in these traditions of liberation. But we know that in the next week we have to hold our legislators accountable. We know that we have to end abusive restraints. We know the Department of Correction needs better oversight, and we know we have to end prolonged isolation. Senate Bill 1059 does that. New York just passed the HALT Act. It was signed into law. It's time for Judiciary to vote it out of committee. It's time for the General Assembly to pass it, and it is time for Governor Ned Lamont to sign it. That is all.
No matter where you live in the country, the simplest way to support this legislation is to retweet one of the relevant tweets on the feed at Stop Solitary CT. This tweet at CT Climate has a link to all the members of the Judiciary Committee. No Rugers to Israel had a virtual rally on March 30th. We'll have coverage next week. Just to report today that in an article by the esteemed Gideon Levy about a Palestinian killed during a demonstration, it was mentioned that tutus, meaning .22 caliber bullets, are used casually every week against demonstrations in the area. Tutus means Rugers. This is the website of No Rugers to Israel, backed by 12 organizations. Now from a panel on March 31st about the future of the Syrian revolution.
It is my absolute pleasure to introduce our first speaker, Laeila Al Shami. She's a Syrian writer and has worked with human rights movements in Syria and across the West Asian North African region. She is the co-author of Burning Country, Syrians in Revolution and War, and a founding member of Tahrir ICN, a network that aimed to connect anti-authoritarian struggles across the Middle East, North Africa, and Europe.
I was asked to give an overview of the current situation in Syria today, and from the vast array of issues that we could talk about, I picked two issues to look at the socio-economic situation and also Iran's role and presence in Syria. The reason I chose these issues is that today's webinar is forward-looking, and these issues are here to stay with us for the foreseeable future. And secondly, because it refutes the currently popular discourse that Assad has won, and shows that his control over the country is incredibly fragile. The socio-economic situation in the country is desperate and is affecting communities across Syria, with 83% of Syrians living below the poverty line and struggling to make ends meet, or even afford the basic necessities. The UN's World Food Programme reports that food prices have increased by 376% since October 2019. The price of bread, a staple, has increased 247% since last year. There are shortages of basic food and fuel, and electricity blackouts are common. The Syrian currency has completely collapsed. The salary of a state employee is now equivalent to around $20 per month, as opposed to $400 per month in March 2011. This situation has caused widespread anger amongst the population, even among communities seen as being loyal to the regime. We've witnessed periodic protests against the regime due to the economic situation, and a number of pro-Assad commentators have actually been arrested due to their criticism of the economic situation and the regime's handling of it. There's a number of reasons for the current situation. The primary reason, of course, is the whole-scale destruction of the country by the regime and its Russian ally, including physical infrastructure, housing, agricultural land, and production facilities. The scale of regime corruption and the rampant crony capitalism, which enriches the pockets of those individuals connected to the regime, and which was a problem prior to the uprising, has since been greatly exacerbated. For example, the way in which regime loyalists or family members of the president have been awarded lucrative contracts to construct luxury residential areas when a significant proportion of the population no longer has access to housing. Another example could be the Russian company that has been granted 70% of all revenues generated from the production and export of phosphate, which is equivalent to millions of dollars annually over the next 49 years being siphoned out of the country and given to Russia as a reward for its support for the regime. The economic and financial crisis in Lebanon has also exacerbated the situation, as many Syrian businessmen and individuals deposited savings in Lebanon. For example, the current wheat shortage was compounded by this because all of the main wheat importers have their bank accounts in Lebanon. Also, many Syrians were dependent on remittances from Syrian workers in Lebanon, many of whom have now lost their employment. The situation is also further exacerbated by the current wide-ranging sanctions on the country, which have increased since the US brought in the Caesar Act in late 2019. Unlike previous sanctions, which have widespread support from Syrians, which targeted those individuals affiliated to the regime, either political, military, or security figures, these sanctions are much more controversial, as they also target business and sectors dealing in oil, electricity, IT, and other sectors, and contribute to a shortage of goods and services, which negatively impacts on the civilian population. Whilst humanitarian aid is exempt from sanctions, many NGOs have reported being affected, as people are now very nervous to do business with Syria. However, we need to be very careful because some people are using the sanctions issue to rehabilitate the regime and not hold it accountable for its crimes. So we need to be very clear that sanctions are not the main cause of the current socioeconomic crisis. And finally, the coronavirus pandemic has also had an impact because Syrians are totally dependent on humanitarian aid, and donor countries are cutting their budgets because of the financial pressures on them at home. So to turn to Iran, I think it's fair to say that parts of the country are now living under Iranian occupation. Iran has supported the regime since the early days of the conflict. It sees Syria as a key part of the axis of resistance towards the US and Israel, a Shia bloc crossing Iraq, Syria, Lebanon to the Mediterranean. So losing control of Syria or the regime would be a huge strategic loss to Iran's interests in the region. Whilst Iran has supported large numbers of fighters in Syria, with sectarian Shia militias from Iraq, Lebanon, Iraq, and Afghanistan, and has established numerous military bases, it's also been the main backer of the regime financially and economically. Since 2013, Iran's provided Syria with credit lines to import fuel and other goods, and is a major trading partner. Iran is expanding its presence in Syria and seeks to embed itself in Syrian society in a way that Russia does not. It also appears to be cementing its presence economically in order to ensure it maintains influence in the event of a peace deal, which would call on all foreign militia to leave. So part of its strategy is buying up real estate, which it's doing in Damascus, Homs, Deir ez-Zor and Aleppo. Properties of Syrians who have been displaced by the conflict are now inhabited by members of Iranian-backed militia and their family. Land belonging to displaced Syrians has been auctioned off at symbolic prices in areas such as Homs, and the main buyers are members of Iranian-backed militia. In Damascus, for example, people report that there's a noticeable change in demographics, such as areas of Bab Tuma and Bab Sharki, which previously had a large Christian community and now have a very heavy presence of members of Iranian militia. Even shop signs and adverts are now often written in Farsi. People are selling their properties to Iranians due to the desperate economic situation, and in some cases because they're unable to return to their homes. Lucrative contracts have been awarded to Iranian companies for reconstruction and infrastructure. Iran also has a soft power strategy, establishing Iranian cultural and education centers and encouraging people to convert to Shiism. And it also tries to buy loyalty. Iranian militias can pay Syrian youth up to $700 a month, whereas the Syrian army only pays $40. Whilst many Syrians cannot return to their home country, the regime has fast-tracked naturalization of foreigners to ensure Iranians and others can become citizens. So it's really becoming clear that the forced displacement of oppositional communities and the repopulation of those areas with communities perceived as loyal was part of a deliberate strategy by the regime to change demographics and to ensure a loyal constituency in areas it controls. It appears that one reason there is a political stalemate is that the regime is in fact buying time to create facts on the ground in its favour. So I'll just finish by saying that anti-Iranian sentiment in Syria is at an all-time high. Iranian policy in Syria and also in Iraq has vastly increased the Sunni sense of victimhood, which is a contributing factor in the rise of extremist jihadist groups. The Iranian presence has also led to repeated bombing of Syria by Israel on Iranian targets, as Israel doesn't want an Iranian presence on its northern border. So to link back to my introduction, I think the withdrawal of Iran would lead to a significant weakening of the regime. And this is why the Assad regime has not won. It's completely dependent now on foreign powers to run the country and cannot manage the massive economic crisis engulfing the country. Thank you.
The bulk of our program will be a return to the panel that we started last week about Israel, Jews, and democracy.
I'm delighted with how everything turned out and all the people around the world that are joining us. I started with this idea from an essay I wrote on my blog, which was called Conflating Judaism and Zionism, Bad for the Jews. And so for me, the problem that I'm seeing is that when I was growing up, my Jewish identity, based on Hebrew school and based on going to university and studying Judaica, the model that was offered to most diaspora Jews was a liberal Zionism. And as Avram said so well, liberal Zionism is based on the premise that Israel can be both a Jewish state and a democratic state. And I think that most diaspora Jews accepted that. It was sort of like you took it in with your mother's milk. It was a holy, trinity, as you will, of a Jewish belief. But the problem is that over time, the two elements of this, Judaism and democracy, became untenable. And I think that the problem right now is that Judaism is a religion, obviously. Zionism, which is the underpinning of Israel, is a political ideology. So you're trying to posit right now Israel as both a nation and a religion, and or as a religious identity, and that can't be done, especially as Israel is moving farther and farther to the right, as Avram also pointed out. You have now in Israel, in which settlers who, say in 1968, were a small minority, basically have taken over all the levers of power of the state. So what you have right now is basically a settler state. Yes, it's true that settlers are maybe only 20 or 30, 20, 25% of the population of Israel, but that's really not the arbiter of or the measure of their power. All the Knesset, the right-wing majority in the Knesset, is oriented completely towards satisfying the settlers, and their interests are completely served by the ministries. And I'm not just talking about stealing Palestinian land or settlements or anything like that. I'm talking about every major decision that happens in Israel has a Judeo-supremacist underpinning. So we should also expand a little bit on what Avram said about white supremacy and what I'm calling Judeo-supremacy. They really, and Avram again expanded on this very well, Judeo-supremacy of the settler movement and of the contemporary state of Israel is very much in alignment with white supremacy in the United States, with the sort of supremacist governments in Poland and in Hungary and the other countries that Avner mentioned. So what does a diaspora Jew do in response to this? Basically, diaspora Jewish leaders have sat back on their tushies, whatever you want to call it, and they've accepted this dichotomy. They've accepted. They do not question this liberal Zionist ethos that we've grown up with, even though it's no longer relevant. Our leaders in the diaspora are the Israel lobby in the UK, the Board of Deputies, and here in the United States, the Conference of Presidents of major Jewish organizations, is captured by an old concept, and it refuses to acknowledge that the basis of this concept of liberal Zionism is dead. It refuses to acknowledge that the two-state solution, which was also the underpinning of liberal Zionism, is dead. It's impossible to have a two-state solution, but no one in the leadership of any of these diaspora communities is willing to look this in the face and say what it is and what it has become. So, to my mind, we have to work in the diaspora to create a separation between the diaspora and Israel. And I don't mean this in the sense of a permanent separation. I mean it in the sense of we have to say when Israel is morally wrong, and we have to say we're not going to be collaborators with this moral injustice. We're going to set a different course. We're going to set a different vision and a different image of Israel. And to the extent, I mean, this goes into what BDS represents. So I would favor a Jewish version of BDS, which is not just political, which BDS is largely a political movement. I think that we as Jews have to have a spiritual dimension to this. We have to have an ethical dimension to this. We have to use our sources, our biblical prophetic sources, to say that we are going to represent a different perspective, a different Jewish perspective on what this is. And we have to say that Israel is not I don't even call Israel Jewish in this traditional sense that diaspora Jews recognize it. I call it pagan idolatry. It's the worship of what I call stones and bones, the worship of land, the worship of power, the worship of blood and racial purity. These, to me, are not Jewish values, but these are the values that underpin the state of Israel. And we have to redefine what it is to be Jewish, and let Israel should be a state, and it should not have anything to do with religion. Religion is poisoning this dialogue, and we have to eradicate it from our kind of our view of what Israel is. And with that, I think I'll let everyone move on.
Thank you, Richard, very much. Let us move straight on then to Miri Weingarten here in London, as I am.
I suppose since we're talking about identity, I'll just preface by explaining where I come from. I grew up, I suppose, in the same sort of community as Avram Burg did, in the religious Zionist community in Israel. I then left religion. So today, if I were to be asked to put, religion, I would write none. I don't couch my Judaism in religious terms, nor in national terms, which of course then begs all of the questions that are being discussed. The other thing I'd also like to say is that I'm missing, I suppose I'm missing the Palestinian voice in terms of what their definitions would be in terms of the state of Israel and what Judaism means, what Zionism means, etc. And it's quite difficult to find Palestinians who will talk about Jewish identity and anti-Semitism, either because they don't feel comfortable doing so or because they're not allowed to. And an exception is Dr. Raif Zrek, that I've recently listened to, and I find his insights on this issue very, very interesting. I'll come back to that later. But Avrum's discussion raised two questions in my mind. One in relation to what that does in Israel, in the power relationship that is Israel. And the second is what that does to Jews here in the UK. And I know that a lot of the people here are from the US or from Israel, but also from the UK. And also what it does to Jews who've sort of moved from another country to Israel, or from Israel to another country. And in terms of what it does to the power relations in Israel, I'm wondering, it's just a question in my mind rather than a criticism, but if the de jure decision to say that this is a nation state of the Jewish people, renders Israel as an apartheid state in terms of law and not just various practices, then is it at all possible for a white person in apartheid South Africa to renounce their whiteness? Is it possible for somebody to come to a court or to an office and to say, I want to give it up, I don't want to be this? And it's a difficult question because in a way, in Israel, if you're Jewish, you are cast as the oppressor. You have no space to be very much else. And so if you're a person of conscience, you're forced into action, activism, attempts, which so far have failed to achieve justice and equality. And a provocation to say, then I don't want to be this Jewish definition. It makes sense in terms of the internal Jewish discourse, but it makes no difference to Palestinians. The power relation remains. And I say this not in a negative way. I faced the problem myself when seeking solidarity when I was still living in Israel-Palestine. My solidarity with Palestinians had a huge elephant in the room because the occupation was between us and continues to be. And so that's one question that was in my mind. The second question that was in my mind relates to here. And I suppose I'm not exactly with the identity of a British Jew born here. So I grew up, I was the child of the Zionist dreams of my parents. I grew up as the majority, the person who thinks they have no color and whose privileges are at the expense of the oppressed. And I moved from there to here, and here I seek an identity of a minority, and it doesn't quite work as a religion. As I said, my religion is none. It doesn't work as an ethnicity, as some people who will have been following this sort of discussion in the UK recently, is Jewishness an ethnicity? There are Black Jews, Arab Jews, Kurdish Jews. How does that work? What is the identity? And in that question or gap, there is this hijacking of Jewish identity by Israel. That's how I feel. I feel as if I have no escape. When Rav Zrek, to come back to him, when he was speaking, he talked always about how identity, as well as anti-Semitism, are dependent on context. He said in 1948, Europeans saw Jews as in the back of a refugee fleeing, whereas Palestinians saw Jews with the face of a settler coming. He also says that anti-Semitism before 1948 is a different thing from anti-Semitism after 1948. And that is because now Jews have a state. But what if I don't want that? What if I want to say, well, what do you mean I have a state? I choose to live here. Why do you tell me that I must, by definition, be implicated by the actions of Israel if I've left, if I've decided to reverse, if you like, what my parents did? And that is a question that is difficult in particular, and I won't go into the cesspit that is the discourse in the labor and the left all around the issues of anti-Semitism. But I think that this question arises more and more urgently as time goes on. It's echoed in what Richard was saying about this wish to shrug it off and to reject, but at the same time, it's almost impossible to do so. Can't really leave it. I think I don't know how much time I still have. I had a couple of other things to say, but maybe a minute
or so, final.
A minute or so.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think that I like to think, with an optimism that may not be merited, that here solidarity is possible. So here, maybe Jews as a minority, through the minority identity, can make common cause with other minorities, even though I know that a Jew born here, just by virtue of birth, can decide to pick up and leave if things get uncomfortable here. I know that Jews would like to not see that Israel is a sort of insurance policy for them, but it is. Whereas a Palestinian, for the very same reason, can't do that, has to live with anti-Arab racism, anti-Muslim racism, anti-Palestinian sentiment, but has nowhere to go, as other refugees and other minority groups here who have nowhere to go. But despite that, I think that here solidarity is possible, or I hope so. And I would like to find a language in which to do that. In particular, at this time, this horrific time of discourse of triumphalist nationalism and racism, we must find solidarity rather than competing with each other for victimhood. We must put our focus on the perpetrators and the mechanisms of perpetration, which are actually the same everywhere.
We've had some brief reports about Putin's rival Alexi Navalny. Navalny survived poisoning, was taken to Germany for treatment, returned to Russia where he was arrested, swiftly put on trial and given a years-long sentence in prison. Now it may be that he's slowly being killed in detention. He's in a high security prison where he's awoken every hour during the night. In an article in the New York Times, the writer, himself a Russian who survived an assassination attempt, writes about Navalny's lawyers. When they finally gained access to their client, they saw a man hardly able to walk, struggling to get off his bed, unable to feel his right leg, and suffering sharp and constant back pain. Now, Navalny, in protest, has declared a hunger strike. Later in April, activists with Jewish Voice for Peace will take part in a program paying tribute to 6 courageous women. Save the date. That's our program for today. Keep safe, folks, but keep active. I'm Stanley Heller for The Struggle.